Hello, my dear friends. They bled onto straw, wiped with rags, and washed their underwear once a month if lucky. Hidden from the battlefield but no less brutal. Women's hygiene during l'Abiyantu was a quiet war of its own. With no toilet paper, no proper pads, and barely any clean water, they endured infections, shame, and silence in shelters, camps, and factories. You think you know war, but you haven't seen what mouldy cloth, reused sanitary rags, and communal wash basins can do to a body. Tonight, you'll step into the foul, forgotten rituals women used to survive the dirtiest war of the century. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and how long you've been there. It's always fun to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the makeshift toilets of wartime shelters during the 1940s, the first thing to notice would not be the stench, but the absence of anything resembling toilet paper. Buckets, pits, or crude holes lined with planks were all that many women had. After relieving themselves, they reached for what little they could find. Newspaper scraps, torn rags, and even leaves served as the only means of cleaning. The paper was often damp, crumpled, and stained from prior use. But in times when survival consumed every thought, no one dared to waste something so valuable. Cleanliness became a luxury, and hygiene was an afterthought buried under the weight of war. In cities under rationing, real toilet paper was nearly mythical. Shops that once sold soft rolls now stock only food and coal. For women in crowded tenements, outhouses were shared by dozens of families. Some tried to wash the reused papers in dirty water and hang them to dry near the stove. Others stored piles of old newspaper under beds or behind the door, ready for use. It is almost absurd to think of a time when reading the news came second to wiping with it. The ink bled onto skin, leaving faint words that no one cared to read. Every trip to the toilet became a small act of endurance, performed in the dim light of candles or lanterns. The risk of infection was constant. The paper carried germs from countless hands, and the reused rags harboured bacteria impossible to wash away without hot water or soap. Many women suffered painful urinary infections, but doctors were scarce, and medicine was scarce for soldiers. Some tried wiping with leaves or straw gathered from the ground, believing nature to be cleaner than city waste. Yet these choices often made things worse, as the rough edges scraped skin already raw from neglect. Compared to today, it would be like walking into a restroom and finding only yesterday's newspaper waiting beside the sink, yet still being grateful it existed. Those who worked in munitions factories or hospitals had no better conditions. Toilets were few and poorly maintained. The constant hum of war machines filled the air, leaving no space for privacy or comfort. Many women avoided using the facilities altogether, holding their bladders until pain forced them to go. Their bodies adapted to scarcity in ways that now seem unimaginable. Bladder infections became so common that they were barely mentioned, dismissed as another inconvenience of war life. The smell of ammonia lingered on clothing, an invisible reminder of the body's suffering. In rural areas, life was simpler but no cleaner. With water rationed and soap precious, women dug shallow pits behind their homes and used leaves, straw, or handfuls of soil. Rainwater sometimes replaced washing. Children grew up thinking it was normal, learning to clean themselves with whatever the earth offered. When visitors from the city arrived, they too had no choice but to adapt. I find it haunting to imagine those quiet moments when a woman, exhausted from work and hunger, crouched in a cold corner with nothing but a scrap of paper between her and disease. The body learned to tolerate discomfort, smells were ignored, stains accepted, and infection endured. Wartime meant every resource was devoted to soldiers and industry. Civilians, especially women, were left to manage decay with creativity. Some soaked paper scraps in a mix of ashes and water, thinking it made them cleaner. Others whispered about using cloth strips cut from old clothing, but those had to be washed, and washing required soap, which was often gone. The choices were all bad, and the best one could hope for was to stay alive without too much pain. Propaganda posters urged citizens to stay strong and make sacrifices. Hygiene, though vital, was barely mentioned. The government promised victory through endurance, not cleanliness. Diseases of the body were tolerated as long as the spirit remained obedient. Mothers passed on habits to daughters, teaching them to fold paper neatly or rinse fabric quickly. These acts, small and repetitive, became lessons in survival. The human body can adapt to nearly anything, even the indignity of filth, when the world outside offers no mercy. By the end of the war, infection rates among women had quietly risen. Doctors later noted the link between poor sanitation and the long-term damage it caused to women's reproductive health. Many were left with chronic pain, bladder weakness, or infertility, yet none received recognition for the quiet suffering they endured. The focus remained on rebuilding cities, not bodies. In a society eager to celebrate victory, there was no place for the stories of women who bled and burned in silence. The tragedy of the missing toilet paper was more than an inconvenience. It symbolized the daily humiliation of life under rationing, where even the most private acts became public struggles. Cleanliness was a forgotten dream, replaced by endurance and shame. It revealed how war stripped humanity down to its most primitive needs, and how easily dignity could be sacrificed in the name of survival. The story of the women who wiped with newspapers and rags is not just about poverty, but about resilience. They found ways to exist in a world that refused them comfort. They learned that even filth could be endured when there was no other choice, and in that endurance, they preserved a kind of strength that history rarely honours. The absence of toilet paper was only one of many cruelties women faced during the war. It was a small symptom of a much larger neglect that touched every corner of their lives. Behind every ration card and every factory shift was a body quietly decaying, waiting for the war to end before it could heal. The lack of toilet paper told a story of survival in its rawest form. What came next revealed how women continued to suffer even beyond the latrine, through the things they wore and the things they used each month. The fabric that replaced proper care would bring consequences far more painful than paper ever did. There were no proper sanitary pads during the war, only what could be found or made by hand. Women relied on scraps of cloth, old towels, pieces of burlap, or even dried straw wrapped in thin fabric. Each item was used again and again until it tore apart. Soap was scarce, water was rationed, and boiling anything for hygiene was a luxury few could afford. Washing meant wasting water that might be needed for cooking or drinking, so the same damp cloths were hung by the stove to dry, only to be used again the next day. The smell of iron and mildew clung to the air, faint but constant, a quiet reminder of how little control women had over their own comfort. Those who worked in factories during long shifts had no choice but to wear these improvised pads for hours at a time. When they bled through, they folded the fabric and continued working. Changing meant waiting for a break that might never come. The discomfort became normal, absorbed into the rhythm of labour. Some lined their underwear with newspaper or straw, hoping it would soak enough to last until the day ended. It is both tragic and absurd that in an era producing weapons by the millions, women could not find a clean piece of cloth for themselves. Blood dried against skin, leaving rashes that burned under the rough wool of their uniforms. The risk of infection was high. Damp, reused fabrics bred bacteria that no one could see. Women complained of fever, pain, and chills. But these symptoms were dismissed as exhaustion. Medical supplies were reserved for soldiers, not for those who worked or waited at home. When the body's defences failed, illness crept in silently. Some women developed chronic infections that never healed. Others died of what was called women's fever, a vague term that disguised the reality of blood poisoning caused by unwashed cloths. If compared to today, it would be like being told to use an old kitchen rag every month and to be grateful for it. In rural areas, women often used dried grass or straw tied together with a thin thread. It scratched their skin, left splinters, and offered little protection. When it rained, the material absorbed moisture from the air and turned into a soggy mess. Yet it was still better than nothing. Mothers taught their daughters how to prepare these makeshift pads in secret, whispering instructions at night. There was shame in even talking about it. No one wanted to admit that their bodies could not be properly cared for. Blood was treated as a private burden, hidden from sight, even when it caused real suffering. The quiet endurance of these women feels more painful to imagine than the hunger or cold they faced. The war's rationing system made cloth precious. Everything was patched, reused, and traded. Old shirts were torn into strips, sheets were cut into squares, and even baby clothes were sacrificed. A single piece of fabric might serve for months. Women rinsed them in dirty water, wrung them out, and hung them on lines indoors, away from prying eyes. There was no sunlight to disinfect, no fresh air to dry them properly. The dampness never truly left, only spread its smell across the room. Men never asked how women managed. It was a topic that did not exist in conversation, as though the war had erased even the right to speak about one's own body. When infections spread, women turned to home remedies. Some used vinegar, salt water, or even alcohol to clean their wounds. Others burned their old rags in despair, only to regret it later when they had nothing left. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and doctors rarely saw female patients for what they called domestic issues. A woman had to be nearly dying before anyone paid attention. Even then, treatment was rough and often too late. In the hierarchy of suffering, female pain stood near the bottom, tolerated but never treated. There were moments of bitter irony. Posters encouraged women to keep working for the nation's victory, to stay clean and strong, yet the same government rationed away the materials that could have made that possible. Factories produced uniforms, bandages, and tents by the ton, but not one official program supplied clean cloth for menstrual care. The hypocrisy of praising female sacrifice while ignoring their most basic needs is hard to overstate. Women bled in silence, smiled in photographs, and carried on because stopping was not an option. History remembers their labour but not the stains that marked it. The social silence around menstruation deepened the problem. Talking about it was considered improper, even among women. Pain and infection were hidden behind tight smiles and long skirts. When someone fell ill, neighbours called it weakness, not contamination. The shame attached to natural biology allowed the suffering to continue unchecked. It turned the simplest need into something unspeakable, making each woman face it alone. By the final years of the war, many women suffered long-term health effects. Scarring, infertility, and chronic infections became part of their lives. Some never connected these conditions to the makeshift pads they had been forced to use. The war ended, but the damage remained, etched deep into the bodies of those who had no choice but to endure it. Factories reopened, products returned to the shelves, but there were no reparations for what had been lost in the silence of those years. Menstruation during the war was not just a physical ordeal. It revealed how deeply neglect and shame shaped women's existence. Every reused cloth, every secret wash, and every infection told the same story: survival through degradation. It was a quiet war of its own, fought with rags and pain instead of guns and steel. The story of women forced to use old fabric shows how necessity can erase dignity. What was meant to be a small, private discomfort became a public symbol of neglect. It exposed the indifference of a system that celebrated strength while letting half its people rot from within. And in that neglect, something even darker began to grow, a pattern of reuse and denial that would spread far beyond menstruation itself. The lack of proper pads left women trapped between shame and pain. What they did to keep clean during their monthly cycles would soon extend to the rest of their daily hygiene, as even their underwear became another battlefield of endurance. What seemed unbearable then was only the beginning of what their bodies would be forced to tolerate. Under wartime conditions, washing even the smallest piece of clothing became a problem that demanded patience and sacrifice. Water was precious, rationed, and often dirty before it ever reached a basin. Women used whatever source they could find: rainwater caught in buckets, muddy well water, or water left over from washing dishes. Each drop carried the weight of scarcity. Laundry was done in basins placed on cold floors, with hands red from the chill and soap long since replaced by substitutes made from ash or clay. Underwear, small and intimate, had to be washed with care but was rarely truly clean. The smell of damp fabric lingered through rooms, reminding everyone that cleanliness had become a forgotten luxury. There was no antibacterial soap, no disinfectant, no detergent to dissolve the dirt. Women rubbed fabric between their palms, sometimes sprinkling a little salt or soda to help, though it did little. The water quickly turned grey, cloudy with residue from skin, sweat, and the dirt of labour. In many homes, that same water was reused for multiple washes. The idea of freshness was replaced by the simple hope that the stains would fade. It is almost comical how a nation building bombs and airplanes could not provide its citizens a bar of soap to wash their underwear. The effort left their hands cracked and their clothing still smelling faintly of the body. Drying was its own trial. In winter, the air was heavy and damp. Laundry lines hung above stoves or across cramped rooms, with steam mixing into the air. Clothes took days to dry, and many women had no choice but to wear them still damp. The moisture pressed against their skin for hours, seeping into every fold of fabric. Soon, the itch began, a slow, relentless irritation that spread like a hidden rash. Fungal infections grew quietly in the warmth of the body, untreated and unnamed. Doctors saw the symptoms and shrugged. It was another wartime inconvenience, not worth medicine that could be sent to the front. In rural areas, the situation was worse. Wells were often shallow, drawing water tainted with soil, animal waste, or dead leaves. Women fetched buckets of brownish liquid and let the dirt settle before scooping from the top. Sometimes they used that same water for cooking, bathing, and laundry. It was not a choice, but an adaptation to survival. The thin fabric of underwear, when soaked in such water, absorbed whatever the earth gave it. Compared to the sterile detergents and bright white machines of today, the image feels almost prehistoric, yet it was less than a century ago. When those same garments touched the skin again, the cycle of infection began anew. Privacy was rare. In shared shelters or factories, women washed in groups, each pretending not to notice the others. Modesty had no place in a world where water was scarce and space tighter still. The sounds of wringing cloth mixed with coughing and the hum of machines. Every stain became a private shame, and every attempt at cleanliness an act of quiet defiance. The line between hygiene and survival blurred completely. For some, washing underwear meant tearing apart other garments. Old shirts and dresses were cut into smaller pieces to replace those too worn to save. Nothing was thrown away. Even torn fabric was considered valuable enough to patch something else. There was no fabric softener, no bleach, only endurance. Some women soaked their clothes overnight in water that had already been used by others. The smell of sweat and oil was never fully gone, only layered under the scent of damp wood or coal smoke from the stove. I find it deeply unsettling that the simple act of washing, something meant to cleanse, instead became another path towards sickness. When rashes appeared, home remedies replaced medicine. Women applied flour paste, vinegar, or cold compresses, hoping to calm the burning. Infections were hidden under layers of clothing because embarrassment outweighed the pain. These ailments were not considered worthy of attention. Soldiers came home with medals and scars. Women came home with wounds that no one could see. Even among friends, The topic was never discussed. Filth had become part of life, and so had silence. Government posters promoted cleanliness as patriotism, but the irony was bitter. The state rationed soap, restricted water, and then told women to stay pure and healthy for the nation's sake. Public baths closed due to shortages, leaving the poorest with nowhere to wash. In the dark corners of factories, some wiped themselves with oily rags from machinery, because it was the only available fabric. When rashes turned to ulcers, they still returned to work the next morning. Cleanliness was a dream buried under exhaustion. As the war dragged on, these quiet infections grew worse. Women began to lose hair, nails, and even fertility due to untreated bacterial and fungal diseases. Yet no records counted them. Historians wrote about ration cards, not about damp underwear hung near the stove. But those clothes told the real story of deprivation, the story of bodies decaying slowly while nations celebrated endurance. The ritual of washing became an act of illusion. Women tried to preserve dignity in a world that had stripped it away. Cleanliness, even fake cleanliness, gave them a sense of control. They knew the fabric was not pure, yet they folded it neatly and hoped it would be enough. In that hope lay both strength and tragedy. They kept washing, rinsing, drying, wearing, and repeating, because stopping was unthinkable. The memory of dirty water and damp fabric reveals more than poverty. It shows how war reaches into the smallest, most personal corners of life. Even underwear, unseen by the world, became another battlefield for the human body. The women of that time carried their suffering quietly, with no songs or monuments to remember it. Washing underwear with dirty water was more than a sign of hardship. It was a slow erosion of the body's health and spirit, a daily act of endurance disguised as routine. The infections it caused would linger, spreading pain far beyond the laundry basin, and as their skin burned and itched beneath damp fabric, women faced a new challenge: how to stay clean when even bathing became dangerous. Bathing during the war was a privilege very few could afford. Water was rationed, and safety was never guaranteed. In cities under attack, pipes were shattered by bombs, and wells were contaminated by debris. Women learned to live without baths for weeks, sometimes months, surviving on what little water they could collect. A basin of cloudy liquid became their only luxury. They wiped their skin with damp cloths, using ashes, baking soda, or even dry towels to scrub away the dirt. The result was never clean, only less filthy. The skin felt tight and rough, and the smell of sweat never truly left the body. In bomb shelters, bathing was impossible. People slept and ate in the same space, the air thick with smoke and fear. Women carried the scent of smoke, sweat, and dust in their clothes and hair. They tried to stay clean with rags dipped in rainwater or rubbed with ashes to absorb grease. It is almost ironic that the same ashes from burned cities were used to clean the very people the war had left in ruins. Their skin cracked, their hair grew stiff with grime, and every movement reminded them of the dirt clinging beneath their clothes. Still, no one complained. Dirt became another layer of protection, another sign of survival. Water shortages spread beyond the cities. Even in the countryside, wells ran low, and rivers were polluted by oil and chemicals. Women walked long distances to find water, carrying buckets home only to save them for cooking or drinking. Washing the body was a luxury compared to feeding a family. Some used sand or clay to exfoliate their skin, believing it would absorb the sweat. Others used vinegar or alcohol when they could find it. But those who lacked even that learned to tolerate their own scent, to live inside it, and to pretend not to notice. At night, the body itched from the layers of dried sweat. The salt from the skin left stains on the sheets, and lice crept along the seams of clothing. It became normal to see women scratching their arms or necks as they worked. It was not a gesture of disgust, but a reflex born of endurance. Compared to the abundance of soaps and scented lotions today, it is difficult to imagine how anyone could fall asleep with that constant film of dirt on their skin. But exhaustion always won over discomfort. For women working in factories, the situation was worse. The heat from machinery mixed with dust and oil, coating their skin in grime that no towel could remove. They wiped their faces with sleeves, their arms with handkerchiefs, their legs with whatever cloth was dry enough to use. At the end of long shifts, they returned home too tired to care. The effort to wash seemed pointless when the next day would cover them in the same sweat and smoke. In some areas, bathing also became dangerous. Bombings made it unsafe to be outdoors, and even indoor water tanks were at risk of collapse. The sound of running water was a luxury that could draw attention or trigger panic. Many women avoided washing because it meant exposing themselves to cold air or to strangers in public washrooms. Modesty and fear combined into silence. Baths were replaced by quick wipes under blankets or behind curtains. Clean skin became a memory of the world before the war. When illness spread, doctors advised washing with warm water, but few could obey. The sick were cleaned with rags dipped in disinfectant, if available. For the poor, that meant vinegar or salt water. Mothers wiped their children while holding their breath, trying to remove the fever's sweat without wasting a drop. I find it both heartbreaking and admirable that cleanliness, something once taken for granted, became a symbol of courage. Women spoke of washing not as comfort but as risk, something that could only be done when bombs stopped falling. Even when water returned, it carried danger. Pipes delivered murky liquid filled with rust, dirt, or insects. Some women filtered it through old cloth, others boiled it, but most had to use it as it was. Their skin broke out in rashes, and their hair became brittle. Soap, when found, was made from animal fat and smelled rancid, yet they lathered it carefully, grateful for the illusion of purity it gave. To be clean, even for an hour, was to feel human again. The smell of the human body filled every room, mixing with that of food, fuel, and fear. It was not unpleasant to them anymore, only familiar. People could recognize one another by scent. Sweat became a marker of identity, of work, of living through the unlivable. There was no shame in being unwashed, only in being idle. Cleanliness was no longer beauty. It was a kind of defiance. As the war dragged on, many women's skin developed sores and boils from prolonged neglect. Doctors called it dermatitis, but it was more than that. It was a physical record of hardship, a diary written on flesh. No one kept track of how many women died from infections caused by poor hygiene. Their suffering was not heroic enough for propaganda. The war wanted clean victories, not dirty bodies. Bathing became an act of imagination. To pour water over one's skin was to pretend that the world was still normal, that the body still belonged to oneself. When the war ended, some women said the first thing they did was bathe for hours, watching the water turn grey as the past washed away. It was not about hygiene, but about reclaiming something war had taken. To go weeks without bathing was to forget the feeling of freshness, to live inside exhaustion and dust. The body adjusted to filth, the mind adjusted to survival. The war had not only destroyed cities, it had stripped away the simple act of feeling clean, and for those who endured it, cleanliness would forever be tied to memory, to safety, and to peace that could never quite be washed back in. The lack of bathing was not just about water, it was about dignity slowly dissolving in dirt. What came after revealed how even hair, once a mark of beauty, became a symbol of neglect when washing it turned into a struggle against decay. The next sign of suffering would begin right above the forehead, where soap and water had long ceased to reach. Without shampoo, hair became another casualty of the war. Women turned to what they could find, using flour, clay, or even crushed chalk to absorb oil. Each handful was rubbed into the scalp, worked through tangled strands, and brushed out as best as possible. The idea was simple: if water and soap were gone, powder could take their place. But the result was far from clean. The fine particles clung to every strand, mixing with sweat and dust until hair turned heavy and dull. A faint cloud rose each time a woman shook her head, not from perfume or powder, but from the residue of her own makeshift cleansing ritual. The habit spread quickly because there was no alternative. Shampoo was a luxury reserved for the rich, and even they rationed what they had. Ordinary women relied on cupboards and imagination. Bags of flour or jars of clay were shared between neighbours, passed down like precious secrets. It is almost absurd to imagine people sifting flour meant for bread onto their heads in the hope of feeling clean. Yet desperation made logic bend. The flour soaked up grease, but it also glued to dirt. Washing it out required water that few could spare, and brushing only moved the grime around. The hair might have looked matte, but beneath the surface, it was alive with build-up. Over time, the scalp began to protest. The mix of flour and sweat formed a crust that flaked and peeled. It was not dandruff, but something coarser, a layer of residue hardened by time. Women scratched their heads constantly, leaving small red marks at the hairline. Itching became a normal part of daily life, just as hunger was ignored. Compared to the scented shampoos that fill modern shelves, their struggle feels almost prehistoric, yet it existed within living memory. Hair lost its shine, then its softness, until it hung limp and lifeless like fabric left too long in the rain. In some towns, women used river clay, believing it purified the skin. The clay felt cool at first, offering relief from the grime of the day, but without clean water to rinse it properly, the film it left behind trapped oil and dust. The scalp grew dry, then inflamed. Insects, drawn by the warmth, began to appear. Lice nested in the thick build-up near the roots, laying eggs that blended perfectly with the clay. Mothers combed their daughters' hair at night with wooden teeth, crushing the tiny shells between their nails. The sound was soft and constant, a rhythm of survival that no one dared to call disgusting. In bombed cities, where water pipes were shattered and soap non-existent, hair care became a symbol of endurance. Women brushed their hair not out of vanity, but to remind themselves they were still human. Hair that once shimmered now stood stiff, dusty, and streaked with powder. Some tied scarves tightly around their heads to hide it, while others cut it short to make washing easier. Beauty was not the goal. Control was. Every stroke of the brush was an act of defiance against filth. I can almost picture the small satisfaction of running a comb through hair that will never truly be clean, yet still pretending for a moment that it is. The smell of hair filled rooms with something earthy and sour. It carried traces of flour, sweat, and smoke. When women leaned close to one another, they smelled not perfume but effort. They accepted it without comment. Conversation was for rations, bombings, and news from the front, not for hair. Even when lice spread through shelters, no one complained openly. To speak of it was to admit defeat, to confess that the war had won not just the cities, but the body itself. Those who could afford a few drops of oil used it sparingly, rubbing it into the ends to stop breakage. But oil went rancid quickly in the heat of shared rooms, and the smell was worse than dirt. Vinegar rinses became popular for those who still had enough to spare. A faint tang lingered in the air after each attempt at cleanliness, a scent that mixed strangely with the odour of coal smoke. Women accepted these results without complaint, because there was nothing else to do. The human scalp is resilient, but during the war, it became a battlefield. It produced excess oil as the body tried to protect itself from dryness. The more women rubbed powder into it, the more it rebelled. Scabs formed, hair thinned, and small bald spots appeared where skin had cracked. Doctors called it dermatitis. Though few women ever sought help, their heads were covered, their pain invisible. Only the constant scratching gave it away. A gesture so common it became part of the daily rhythm. Hair was once a symbol of pride. brushed carefully before church or gatherings. During the war, it turned into a burden, a mark of hardship that no scarf could completely hide. Women no longer admired one another's hair, they pitied it. It had become a map of deprivation, showing where water had failed and dirt had won. For many, cutting it off was not just a convenience, but a mourning. They watched strands fall to the floor and felt lighter, though not freer. The act of washing with flour or clay revealed how deeply the war reshaped ordinary life. Cleanliness had been reduced to ritual, and ritual to habit. What once separated people from filth now connected them to it. Each grain of powder was a reminder of the things they lacked and the illusions they clung to. The body adjusted, the mind adapted, and life went on in layers of dust. The story of flour and clay was not only about dirt, but about the persistence of hope. Women still cared enough to try, even when their efforts changed nothing. Their hair might have been brittle, their scalps raw, but the will to maintain dignity endured. The powder was both disguise and confession, a fragile link to a world that no longer existed. The desperate attempt to wash hair without water marked the fading line between self-care and survival. What followed showed how neglect spread beyond the scalp, settling deep into the body itself. When even underwear could not stay dry, the decay that began on the head would find its way beneath the skin. Clean clothing became one of the rarest luxuries for women during the war. Factories devoted all available fabric to uniforms, parachutes, and bandages, leaving civilians to manage with what little they owned. Most women had only a few undergarments, worn until the seams thinned and the colour turned grey. Washing them required time, soap, and water, 3 things always in short supply, so they wore them again and again, waiting for a free moment, a drop of warmth, or a place safe enough to wash. By the time water touched the fabric, it had already absorbed days of sweat and dust. The smell lingered like a quiet secret, impossible to escape but never spoken of aloud. Drying was another challenge. In cold rooms or damp shelters, nothing dried properly. Women hung their underwear near stoves, on lines across kitchens, or behind closed doors. The heat of coal and smoke mingled with the scent of damp fabric. Sometimes, when the weather refused to cooperate, they wore the garments while still wet. The chill of moisture against the skin made them shiver, but waiting was not an option. It feels almost absurd that something as intimate as underwear became another battlefield of endurance, soaked in both sweat and sorrow. The constant dampness irritated their skin, creating rashes that burned throughout the day. The body adapted to filth in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. Women learned to ignore the itch, the soreness, and the redness that came from unwashed fabric. Infections spread silently, especially in areas where the air never reaches. Many treated the pain with cold compresses or leftover ointments meant for burns. When supplies ran out, they used whatever they could find, ashes, herbs, or vinegar, believing the sting meant healing. Doctors rarely saw these wounds. Women did not speak of them. There were greater sufferings in the world, and personal discomfort did not seem important enough to name. In factories, the problem grew worse. The constant heat and movement made women sweat through their clothes. With only 1 or 2 pairs of underwear to their name, they rotated between them, washing one while wearing the other. But when water was scarce, even that rhythm broke. Some wore the same garment for a week or more, rinsing it briefly when possible. The fabric hardened from layers of salt and oil, scraping against the skin with every movement. Compared to the disposable hygiene products of today, their struggle feels both unimaginable and cruel, a reminder of how comfort can vanish when survival becomes the only goal. The infection that followed was relentless. The skin cracked, bled, and stung beneath the rough seams. Women rubbed powder or flour over the wounds, desperate to keep them dry. The burning never stopped. Each day was a small act of endurance that no one noticed. The pain was hidden beneath layers of wool and cotton, buried under uniforms and long skirts. No one complained, not because it was easy to bear, but because there was no point in complaining. In bombed towns, water was often contaminated, and soap was considered a treasure. Some washed their underwear in the same basins where they cleaned dishes or vegetables. The water turned grey, yet they still used it, because even dirty water was better than none. The illusion of cleanliness gave a kind of relief. They would hold the damp cloth to their faces, inhale the faint smell of smoke, and pretend it was freshness. The truth was that the fabric never lost its filth. It only changed scent. I can almost see those women standing near stoves, holding garments that still steamed from washing, convincing themselves that the heat meant purity. Children grew up watching their mothers handle these small rituals. They saw how care and shame were mixed together, how survival required silence. When they grew older, the same habits followed them. The line between necessity and neglect blurred entirely. Cleanliness was not about soap, but about pretending that the body was still under one's control. By the middle of the war, skin conditions became common among women of all classes. Blisters, sores, and fungal infections spread quickly. There was no cream, no powder, and no time. The pain became part of the body's rhythm, flaring during work and fading at rest. It was not considered an illness, only life. The same government that demanded strength from its citizens never acknowledged that women's bodies were decaying beneath their uniforms. Their suffering was invisible, hidden in the folds of fabric too small and too old to protect them. When the war ended, many women carried the marks for life. Some developed chronic infections that never healed, while others lost sensitivity from scar tissue that formed after years of irritation. These wounds were not medals, though they were earned through endurance just as surely as any soldier's scar. Clean underwear was one of the first things people bought when peace returned. Not for vanity, but for dignity. It was a small return to humanity after years of grime. The story of dirty underwear is more than a story of scarcity. It is about how quickly dignity erodes when necessity replaces comfort. Each piece of fabric told the same truth that survival often means accepting what should never be normal. Cleanliness, once a daily routine, had turned into a dream that war pushed out of reach. Wearing the same dirty garment was a quiet humiliation carried beneath the surface of every day. It marked a kind of surrender that few wanted to admit, but all endured. The misery beneath the clothes was invisible to the world, yet it shaped the way women saw themselves and their bodies. As the neglect deepened, the damage it caused would no longer stay hidden, for it began to move beyond irritation and into real disease, spreading through the skin and into the bloodstream. Toothbrushes were a rarity during the war, and toothpaste was almost a memory. Most women brushed their teeth with whatever they could find: salt, charcoal, or a pinch of baking soda stolen from the kitchen. Some wrapped old cloth around a finger and rubbed at their teeth until the gums bled. It was a crude ritual, performed out of habit rather than hope. The salt stung, the charcoal left a bitter taste, and the soda made the mouth dry. Yet people called it cleaning. The illusion mattered more than the result. In dim bathrooms or shared wash areas, women leaned over chipped basins, spitting grey water and pretending that the burning meant purity. The war had stripped shelves bare. Factories that once made toothpaste now produce ammunition. Brushes were made of bone or metal and were expensive for anyone outside the upper class. For the poor, teeth became one more thing the war took away. Cavities spread quietly, starting with a dull ache, then swelling into infection. Many women lost teeth before they turned 30. It is darkly humorous that people could build machines to kill from miles away, but could not make a single brush to clean their own mouths. The ache became part of life, accepted the way hunger or cold was accepted. In some places, the black dust from burned wood replaced toothpaste. It absorbed oil, but it also stained everything it touched. Women rubbed the powder onto their gums, leaving their mouths gritty and raw. They carried small pouches of charcoal in their pockets or kept jars of salt by the sink. The cleaning routine was mechanical, done without thought, because not doing it felt like surrendering to decay. If compared to today's rows of bright toothpaste tubes, that sight of women brushing with soot and salt feels almost medieval. Gums swelled and bled easily. Without clean brushes or proper paste, bacteria grew unchecked. The breath of entire families carried the scent of rot. Women tried to hide it with mint leaves when they could find them, or by rinsing with vinegar, but nothing masked it for long. Speaking became painful, chewing unbearable. Some stopped eating solid food altogether, surviving on thin soups. Dental care was not considered a necessity during wartime. Painkillers were reserved for soldiers, and dental clinics were either destroyed or abandoned. Women pulled out their own teeth using a cloth for grip, biting down afterward to stop the bleeding. In shelters, the problem worsened. Hundreds of people shared the same water and air. They brushed their teeth with fingers, rinsing with cups of reused water. Infection spread easily, yet no one talked about it. Mouths were covered with scarves, not out of modesty, but to hide the smell. Children grew up thinking bleeding gums were normal. Mothers told them it meant the teeth were growing stronger. It was easier to lie than to admit there was nothing to be done. The lack of proper dental care reflected something larger. Clean mouths belonged to a world that no longer existed. The war demanded strength, not health, and women met that demand even as their teeth crumbled. They smiled through pain in photographs, lips pressed tight to hide the gaps. I find it haunting to imagine those faint smiles, full of pride and decay, preserved in black and white portraits that still looked dignified. Beneath the calm surface, their mouths throbbed with infection, each nerve screaming in silence. Rural areas offered no relief. Dentists were a distant memory, and supplies never reached small villages. People relied on old remedies passed down through generations. They chewed on sticks, rubbed ashes, and used saltwater rinses when they could. When abscesses formed, some placed hot cloths against their cheeks, hoping the swelling would drain. Others prayed. Many died not from war injuries but from infections that started with a single bad tooth. The body began to adapt in strange ways. The gums hardened, the enamel thinned, and pain dulled into numbness. Some women claimed their mouths stopped hurting after a while, though it was only because the nerves had died. When teeth fell out, they were kept in small jars or wrapped in cloth, as if losing them deserved ceremony. Those who still had teeth learned to eat carefully, cutting food into small pieces and swallowing without chewing. The smell of decay filled homes, yet no one mentioned it. It blended with the other odours of war coal, damp clothes and unwashed bodies. Hygiene had become a performance rather than a practice. People brushed not to be clean, but to remember what cleanliness once felt like. Even a single grain of salt on the tongue brought back the faint memory of better days. After the war, dentists who returned from the front found entire communities with mouths full of cavities and missing teeth. Rebuilding smiles became part of rebuilding lives. But for many women, the damage was irreversible. Their teeth were gone, their gums scarred, and their confidence dimmed. False teeth became a symbol of recovery, though they carried no comfort. The pain had left its mark deeper than the mouth. It had settled into the memory of deprivation itself. Brushing with salt and soot was never truly about hygiene. It was about control, about holding on to something human in a world that had forgotten softness. Every touch of powder, every sting of gum, was an act of defiance against despair. The teeth that survived were not just teeth. They were proof that endurance could outlast neglect. The decay of the mouth revealed the slow unravelling of the body. What began with broken teeth would soon travel deeper, infecting breath, blood, and even the skin. As the war continued, the very air people breathed carried the taste of corrosion, and women would learn that the rot inside the mouth was only a warning of what was coming from within. Bad breath became one of the most common and least spoken miseries of wartime life. It lingered in the air of shelters, factories, and crowded homes where windows stayed shut against the cold. Water was too precious to waste on rinsing, and toothpaste was almost mythical. Women went days without cleaning their mouths properly, their tongues coated in layers of dryness and dust. The smell that rose from their breath was not just unpleasant, it was the scent of starvation and exhaustion. It clung to conversations, seeped into the fabric of scarves, and became part of the invisible atmosphere of war. The dryness began with dehydration. Water was rationed, and drinking came before washing or rinsing. The mouth turned rough and cracked, the tongue stuck to the roof, and saliva dried away. Without moisture, bacteria grew unchecked, feeding on food residue and dying cells. The result was a stench that no mint leaf or salt rinse could disguise. It is almost darkly amusing to imagine entire families talking in whispers, each pretending not to notice the same unbearable odour. Women covered their mouths with handkerchiefs not out of modesty but shame. Even breathing felt like revealing something private. Nutrition worsened the problem, with fresh food scarce. People lived on tinned meat, bread, and powdered substitutes. These foods dried the mouth even more and left metallic traces that lingered on the tongue. Vitamin deficiency weakened gums, causing small sores that bled easily. The taste of iron became familiar, and the smell of blood mixed with decay. If compared to today, it would be like everyone walking around with the metallic tang of rust on their breath, pretending it was normal. The odour of hunger filled every word, every sigh, every exhale. It was the scent of survival. Women rarely brushed their tongues or cleaned their mouths properly. The idea of oral hygiene was limited to scraping teeth with salt or charcoal. Without tools or time, the back of the tongue became a hidden swamp of residue. Each swallow stirred the sourness, each cough released it into the air, yet no one complained. To speak of it was to admit vulnerability, to acknowledge how deeply the war had entered the body, in shelters where hundreds of people lived together. The staleness became overwhelming. The mixture of bad breath, sweat, and smoke created a heavy air that never lifted. People grew used to it, as they did to hunger and fear. The nose adapted, the mind stopped noticing. The body learned to tolerate what once would have caused disgust. I find it strangely haunting that human senses can numb themselves so completely to decay when survival demands it. What would have been shameful in peace became normal in war. Some women tried to fight the smell using improvised methods. They chewed herbs when they could find them, rinsed with vinegar, or sucked on coal dust to mask the scent. Others believed that alcohol could kill germs and swished it around their mouths before swallowing, even when it burned their throats. These were desperate gestures, small rebellions against inevitability. The taste of cleanliness had vanished, replaced by the bitterness of effort that changed nothing. The condition grew worse as months passed. Gums receded, teeth loosened, and small abscesses formed along the jaw. Every infection carried its own odour, sharp and metallic. Some women described it as the smell of rust or old coins. It was not only the mouth that rotted, but the entire system of care. When people stopped expecting comfort, they stopped recognising decay. Doctors noted the symptoms but lacked supplies. They prescribed salt water, though even that was often out of reach. Among factory workers, the problem was nearly universal. Long shifts, constant smoke, and little food created the perfect conditions for oral disease. The combination of dehydration and malnutrition corroded the mouth from within. Women swallowed the taste of iron and salt each day, and at night they exhaled the exhaustion of labour. Their breath smelled of machines, metal, and fear. They did not speak of it because there was no cure. Silence was easier than shame. When the war finally ended, many women were left with damaged gums and missing teeth. The bad breath disappeared only when their mouths were empty. Dentists who treated them years later described the inside of their mouths as landscapes of scars. The odour that once filled rooms was gone, but the memory of it lingered. It had been more than a symptom. It was a measure of how deeply the body had been neglected. Bad breath during the war was not just about hygiene. It reflected the erosion of the self, the slow decay of dignity under constant strain. Clean mouths belonged to a world that required comfort and time, and those were luxuries no one had. Each breath carried the story of deprivation, every exhale proof of what survival cost. The human body endured, but it did not forget. The breath that smelled of rust told a silent truth about what the war did to women's bodies. It was a signal of deeper illness spreading through the blood, a warning ignored because there were too many others. As the stench faded into history, the damage it signaled would not, for what began in the mouth would eventually find its way into the lungs and the very air they breathed. Soap became one of the few things women tried to make for themselves during the war. Factories stopped producing most toiletries, so homes turned into small laboratories of necessity. Pots of fat collected from cooking were saved and stored until enough could be boiled down with lye. The result was a crude bar of soap, grey and soft, with a smell that clung long after washing. It did not foam, it did not shine, and it often left the skin feeling tighter than before. Still, it was precious. Even a bad soap was better than none at all. The smell was the hardest part to bear. It mixed animal grease with the sour scent of ash, filling every corner of the kitchen where it was made. Women stirred the mixture carefully, their hands wrapped in old rags to avoid burns. The lye burned the eyes and throat, but no one complained. When the soap hardened, it was cut into small pieces and shared among families. It is strangely ironic that something meant to bring cleanliness carried the stench of decay instead. Yet no one dared to throw it away. Each bar was rationed, broken into slivers, and used until it disappeared. When washed with this soap, the skin turned dry and red. The fat clung to the pores, trapping dirt rather than removing it. For the face, it was too harsh. For the body, not strong enough. Some women tried softening it with water or mixing in herbs, but nothing helped. After bathing, the skin stung, then peeled in patches. The sensation of cleanliness was short-lived, replaced by a tightening itch that never fully faded. If compared to modern products, it would be like washing the body with candle wax and caustic soda and still calling it luxury. Women used it sparingly, mostly for hands and clothes. It never foamed, so scrubbing required force. Fingertips cracked from the friction, nails split from dryness. The grey residue stained the fabric instead of whitening it. Still, they kept making more. Soap became a trade, exchanged for bread or fuel. In small towns, women gathered once a week to boil batches together, stirring in silence as the smell filled the air. They worked not for beauty, but for survival. In cities, finding fat for soap was almost impossible. Meat was rationed, and whatever grease remained from cooking went to the military. Those who managed to save a few scraps of fat treated them like treasure. Some substituted animal oil with leftover margarine or used stale butter scraped from tins. The soap they made was softer, almost sticky, and spoiled quickly, but no one had the heart to waste it. The smell of rancid fat lingered on their hands for hours, yet it was still considered a sign of cleanliness. The irony deepened in the way people spoke about it. Government leaflets praised homemade ingenuity, calling it patriotic to make one's own soap. Photographs showed smiling women with clean aprons, but never showed their cracked hands or the smell that followed them. I find it quietly tragic that even in acts of cleanliness, women were made to bear the odour of the war itself. There was no perfume strong enough to hide it. Those who could not make soap used substitutes, ashes, sand, or baking soda. They scrubbed their bodies until the skin burned. Some used the same bar for laundry, dishes, and bathing, letting it shrink into a soft grey lump. It was never clean, but it gave comfort to believe it was. The scent became a constant presence. one that marked homes as surely as the sound of planes overhead. For sensitive areas, the soap was torture. The harsh chemicals caused rashes and bleeding, but women had no alternative. They diluted it with water, hoping it would soften, though it rarely did. The pain was sharp and private, endured without complaint. Doctors warned of infection, but offered nothing to prevent it. Cleanliness hurt, but dirt hurt more, so they continued. In shelters and barracks, the sharing of soap became an act of kindness. A single bar was cut into pieces and passed between hands. Women memorized the smell of the one they used last week, as if scent itself connected them to safety. Soap meant order, even when it burned the skin. When peace finally returned, the first things women bought were soft soaps and scented powders. The smell of lavender or rose brought tears to some, not for beauty but for memory. To hold a bar that foamed easily felt like holding proof that life could be gentle again. The grey wartime soap was thrown away, but its memory clung to the body long after. Homemade soap was both salvation and punishment. It cleaned what could be seen while leaving invisible scars beneath. Every bar was a symbol of endurance, ugly, harsh, and necessary. It told the story of women who kept themselves and their homes from collapsing into filth when the world gave them nothing else. The soap made from fat and ashes washed away dirt but left behind pain. What followed would show that even the smallest routines of hygiene, like shaving or grooming, carried the same cruelty and danger, turning ordinary acts into daily risks that scarred the skin as deeply as the war itself. Shaving was one of the first habits women abandoned during the war. Razors, once a simple tool of vanity, became impossible to find. Factories shifted production toward blades for soldiers, leaving civilians to improvise. Some women shared old razors among neighbours, replacing blades only when they rusted through. Others used the same dull edge again and again, dragging it across dry skin until it bled. The act was painful, but still considered necessary by those who refused to surrender to neglect. The rest gave up entirely, letting their hair grow as nature intended, until smooth skin became a forgotten luxury. The body changed in silence. Hair grew thick under arms, on legs, and sometimes on faces, creating a shadow where none had been before. At first, women tried to hide it. Long sleeves, stockings, and scarves became shields against embarrassment. But as the war dragged on, modesty gave way to fatigue. There were greater concerns than beauty. Water was scarce, mirrors were broken, and privacy was gone. The body became practical, not decorative. It feels strangely ironic that a time obsessed with discipline and order left women covered in hair and scars from dull blades. The sight of unshaven legs or bandaged ankles said more about survival than rebellion. Those who continued to shave did so with whatever they could find. Some used old razor blades passed down from husbands or brothers. The edges dulled quickly and tore at the skin. Small cuts turned into open wounds, and without proper cleaning, infections spread. Boils formed under the arms, filled with pus and pain. Women dabbed at them with rags soaked in vinegar or alcohol, wincing at the sting. They covered the wounds with cloth and went back to work, pretending not to notice the constant throb. Compared to the sterile razors and scented creams of today, their struggle seems both primitive and cruel. In rural areas, shaving was seen as unnecessary. With no electricity or running water, few had time or reason to care. Women there wore long skirts and high socks, their legs hidden beneath layers of fabric. Body hair became invisible, forgotten like so many other small vanities. But in cities, where propaganda posters still displayed idealized images of clean, orderly women, the contrast was painful. The women in the pictures looked polished, untouched by grime, while real women stood before cracked mirrors, holding rusted blades. The risk of infection loomed over every attempt to stay clean. Blood mixed with sweat and dirt, seeping into clothing. Without antiseptics, Even the smallest wound could turn dangerous. Women whispered warnings to one another about friends who had fallen ill after a single bad shave. Yet they kept trying. To shave was to hold on to the idea of control, to remind oneself that beneath the filth and fear, the body still belonged to them. I find it quietly heartbreaking that such a simple act of care became an act of courage. In many homes, razors were shared among family members. Fathers used them in the morning, daughters at night. The blades dulled quickly, but no one dared to throw them away. They were rinsed in cold water and wiped with a cloth, leaving behind streaks of rust. Each use carried the risk of blood and infection. Some women used scissors to trim hair instead, working carefully by candlelight. Others burned it off using matches, a method both dangerous and desperate. The smell of singed skin lingered long after. Another reminder of the body's humiliation. Fashion adapts to circumstance. Skirts grew longer, sleeves extended, and dark stockings concealed what could not be removed. Hair became a secret shame rather than a visible flaw. Those who dared to shave regularly risked ridicule for wasting resources. Clean skin was seen as vanity in a world that demanded sacrifice. Dirt was patriotic. Grooming was selfish. Still, many women stole moments to care for themselves, even if only once a month. It was a quiet rebellion, a way to feel human when the world demanded they be machines. The constant rubbing of fabric against skin made things worse. Without smooth surfaces, friction created sores. Sweat collected around the roots of hair, mixing with dust and bacteria. Rashes turned to infections to scars. Doctors had no ointment to offer. The only advice was endurance. Women applied flour, ashes, or cold cloths, hoping for relief. The skin burned and peeled, but they carried on. When the war ended, advertisements for razors and creams flooded the markets once again. Clean. Hairless women smiled from posters as if nothing had happened, but for many, the damage was permanent. Their skin never fully healed from years of irritation and neglect. Scars traced the places where rusted blades had cut too deeply. Smoothness became a dream rather than a standard, something remembered rather than achieved. Shaving during wartime was not about beauty but about dignity. Each stroke of a dull blade was an attempt to reclaim control from chaos. Hair grew, wounds festered, and still they persisted. Clean skin was not for appearance but for identity, a reminder that they were still women, still individuals, even when everything else had been taken away. The rusted razors and unshaven legs told a story of survival written directly on the skin. The next signs of suffering would no longer stay at the surface, for even beneath clothing, the body continued to decay. The odour of sweat trapped in wool would soon replace the sound of razors, marking a new phase of endurance where even rest offered no relief. Wool was both a shield and a prison during the war. It kept women warm through endless winters, but it also trapped everything the body tried to release. Sweat soaked into the fibres and stayed there, thickening with each day. The fabric absorbed heat but never dried completely, turning every movement into discomfort. Without deodorant or fresh water, there was no way to prevent the smell that grew from within. The air inside factories, shelters, and trains became heavy with the odour of human effort, a mixture of salt, dust, and fear that clung to every coat and sleeve. Women wore the same wool garments for weeks. Undershirts, stockings, and sweaters were too precious to wash often. The lanolin in the fabric trapped moisture, and the body beneath it never fully cooled. The skin itched constantly, rubbed raw by friction. Rashes appeared in hidden places under arms, around the waist, behind the knees. The sweat dried and red-dried until it formed a crust that could be felt even through the layers of clothing. It seems almost cruelly fitting that the same material meant to protect them from the cold also imprisoned them in their own scent. There was no deodorant to mask the smell, only makeshift remedies passed quietly between women. Some dusted their skin with flour or cornstarch, hoping to stay dry. Others rubbed vinegar under their arms, wincing as it stung. The sour odour only mixed with a musk of sweat, creating a new kind of foulness that followed them everywhere, if compared to the freshness of modern fabrics and scented sprays. Their situation feels like a forgotten nightmare woven into cloth, but there was no choice. Wool was all they had, and warmth mattered more than comfort. Factories intensified the problem. Long shifts in hot rooms made women perspire constantly. The thick uniforms absorbed the sweat until they felt like damp armour. The smell of bodies mingled with oil and smoke, coating the air in a sour film. By the end of the day, even the strongest among them could hardly breathe without tasting the scent of exhaustion. Some tried hanging their clothes near open windows, but the cold air only stiffened the wool, locking in the odour. They put the garments back on the next morning, knowing they would sweat through them again. In shelters, the smell was worse. Crowded bodies pressed together, sharing warmth and air. Privacy was gone, and so was the ability to wash. Blankets passed from one person to another, each carrying the scent of whoever had used it before. The air thickened until even breathing became a chore. People stopped noticing, or perhaps they trained themselves not to care. Cleanliness was a memory, and smell became the background music of survival. I find it deeply human and deeply sad that the nose can grow used to anything, even the scent of decay. The skin beneath those wool layers paid the price. Constant moisture bred fungus and infection. Women scratched through fabric until their nails tore. Red sores appeared on shoulders and backs, stinging under the heat of clothing. The irritation spread quickly, but no one called it an illness. It was simply another part of life. Doctors gave vague advice about airing out clothing, though few had the space or safety to do so. Airing out clothes in the open meant risking theft or the elements, so garments remained sealed in darkness, carrying yesterday's sweat into tomorrow. In rural areas, where women worked outdoors, the problem persisted in a different form. Layers of wool were needed to stay warm during long hours in fields or forests. The garments trapped dirt and smoke from cooking fires. The mixture of sweat and ash formed a film over the body, turning the skin a permanent grey. Washing was rare, and soap was too precious to waste on clothes. Women beat their wool garments with sticks to remove dust, but the smell never left. It became a scent associated with endurance itself. When the weather turned slightly warmer, many women fainted under the weight of their clothes. Heat rash spread across their bodies, leaving lines of redness where the wool rubbed hardest. Yet removing layers was not an option. Without them, the cold bit through the thin air. The body lived in contradiction, too hot to bear, too cold to survive. Wool was both protection and punishment, a constant reminder of how little the human body was meant to endure. After the war, when cotton and lighter fabrics returned to stores, women wept at the touch of softness. For the first time in years, they could feel air against their skin without shame or pain. They threw away the old wool garments, but the smell seemed to follow them. It had seeped into their memory, into the very idea of what survival meant. Clean air and light clothes became symbols of peace, not luxury. The woolen layers that trapped sweat and heat told the story of a world too harsh to breathe in. The next stage of their struggle would expose how even the beds they slept in, the very places meant for rest, turned into prisons of odour and disease. And from that darkness, the idea of comfort itself began to feel like a distant dream. Beds, once symbols of rest, turned into traps of odour during the war. Sheets were rarely washed, and mattresses absorbed years of sweat, dust, and despair. Water was too precious to waste on laundry, so bed linen stayed the same through the seasons. They grew heavy with oil from the skin, with flakes of dead cells, and with the scent of bodies that never truly dried. Every time a woman lay down, the warmth of her own body reawakened the smell that had been buried in the fabric. The air above the bed felt thick, almost damp, like breathing through another person's skin. Many women slept alone, not because they wanted solitude, but because closeness had become unbearable. In small houses or shelters, entire families shared the same space, yet the stench drew invisible boundaries between them. The smell of unwashed bodies clung to everything: the pillow, the blanket, even the wooden frame of the bed. Sharing warmth meant sharing scent. Some pretended not to notice, while others moved to corners to sleep on floors or benches just to escape it. It is both sad and grimly ironic that the human body, once a source of comfort, became something people recoiled from. The build-up of dirt and sweat did not happen overnight. Layers of skin and grease collected slowly until the surface of the sheets turned dark. Fleas and lice nested along the seams, feeding on warmth. Women scratched themselves awake, feeling the tiny movements under the fabric. In the morning, they shook the sheets to rid them of insects, though the effort changed little. The smell of salt and rot returned by evening, compared to the crisp beds and perfumed fabrics of modern life. Their nights resembled sleeping inside a garment that could never be cleaned. The skin itself contributed to the odour. Without baths, sweat became acidic, seeping through nightclothes and into bedding. Hair left oily prints on pillows. In winter, when windows stayed shut, the smell had nowhere to go. Rooms grew sour, and even fresh air could not cut through it. Some women tried sprinkling baking soda or ashes on their beds to absorb the stench. Others hung lavender or rosemary near their pillows, but the herbs only masked the scent for a moment before surrendering to it. Sleep no longer brought relief, it only deepened the awareness of filth. For married couples, the problem extended beyond hygiene. Intimacy faded as self-consciousness grew. Wives turned away from husbands, ashamed of their own smell, and men avoided touching skin that carried the scent of decay. Silence replaced affection. The war had made the body a burden, something to hide even in darkness. I can almost feel the loneliness that came from lying inches apart, separated not by fear or distance, but by the stench of human endurance. The beds themselves began to rot. Straw mattresses flattened and absorbed moisture until they resembled mud. Wooden frames cracked under humidity. Some families replaced sheets with sacks, or wrapped themselves in coats. The texture of fabric no longer mattered. Comfort was measured in warmth alone. The smell became so thick that it clung to the air even when no one was in the room. Visitors would wrinkle their noses but say nothing. Shame was understood without words. In hospitals, where women cared for the wounded, the problem was magnified. Patients lay in the same beds for weeks, covered by blankets that had not been washed since their first day. Nurses did what they could, but soap and water were always running out. The odour of sweat mixed with blood and disinfectant, forming a smell that lingered even after rooms were cleaned. Many nurses said they could still smell it in their clothes long after the war ended. Children grew up surrounded by that constant scent of unwashed fabric. It became part of what they thought home smelled like. Mothers tried to open windows when the weather allowed, letting in cold air that smelled of smoke and damp earth. It helped for a few hours, then the odour returned. It was not just trapped in the fabric, it was in the walls, in the air, in the skin of those who lived there. When peace finally came, the first act for many women was to strip their beds. They boiled water, scrubbed linen, and watched grey foam rise as if purging ghosts. Clean sheets became a symbol of victory, of finally being able to rest without shame. The scent of soap and sun-dried fabric felt almost holy. But for years afterward, even the faintest trace of body odour could bring back memories of sleepless nights spent in the dark, surrounded by invisible weight. The beds of war held more than exhaustion. They held the scent of endurance and the silence of self-disgust. What came after would reveal that the struggle against dirt and decay extended beyond the bedroom. Even the most private parts of a woman's body, where softness was once sacred, became battlegrounds of infection and pain. hidden beneath the guise of ordinary survival. Cleaning the most private part of the body became one of the most difficult and painful routines for women during the war. There were no sanitary products, no soft towels, and no comfort. Most women were forced to use old cloth torn from worn-out garments, bits of sack fabric, or even scraps that had already been used to clean floors or dishes. Some had nothing left but newspapers, whose coarse texture and disintegrating ink stained their skin. Each piece of cloth was washed only when water was available, and when it wasn't, it was simply hung to dry and used again. The result was a painful illusion of hygiene, where every attempt to stay clean left more wounds than it prevented. The act itself was done quickly, often in cold corners with little light or privacy. Water was scarce, and there was always a sense of embarrassment that forced women into silence. They crouched over metal basins filled with grey water, using pieces of rough cloth to wipe themselves as gently as they could. The skin, already sensitive from friction and heat, tore easily. The cold water burned against open scratches, and many flinched but said nothing. To survive meant to ignore pain. It feels cruelly ironic that cleanliness, a symbol of decency and health, turned into a source of agony for so many. During menstruation, the problem became worse. There were no sanitary pads, no cotton, and no medical advice. Women folded strips of old rags, tied them in place, and reused them for several days. Without soap or clean water, the clothes became damp and heavy, soaked through with blood and sweat. Mold formed between washes, and the smell was sour and metallic. Some women tried to improve absorption by stuffing straw or leaves inside, but the rough materials caused cuts and irritation. The body that once symbolized fertility and life became a constant source of pain. If compared to today, it would be like trying to stop bleeding with sandpaper and convincing oneself that it was care. In camps and factories, where space and privacy disappeared, hygiene became nearly impossible. Women had to share small washing areas with dozens of others, sometimes with men nearby. Shame kept them from cleaning thoroughly, and infections became common. Burning sensations, swelling, and discharge were so frequent that they were considered normal. No one spoke of it openly, not even to doctors. Pain was just another part of being alive. The war demanded endurance, and the body learned to obey. The lack of soft fabric led to deeper wounds. Friction caused blisters that turned into ulcers. The skin between the thighs darkened and cracked, sometimes bleeding. The smell of infection mixed with that of sweat creates a constant reminder of decay. Some women tried to dry the area with ashes or flour, believing it would absorb moisture. Others applied leftover cooking oil to ease the stinging, but it only trapped dirt deeper into the pores. The pain became part of daily life, flaring with every step, with every hour spent sitting or working. It's almost unbearable to imagine living in a body that constantly hurts, simply for trying to stay clean. In hospitals and shelters, nurses did what they could with what little they had. Salt water replaced antiseptics. Old bandages were rinsed and reused until they fell apart. The infections they saw were beyond simple irritation. Many had turned into chronic conditions that scarred women permanently. Some wounds developed abscesses that had to be drained without anesthesia. Antibiotics were reserved for soldiers, and the suffering of women rarely qualified as urgent. They were told to rest, to stay clean, to endure. But rest was impossible, and cleanliness was a punishment. Silence surrounded the issue. Cultural modesty made it impossible for most women to speak of such things. Pain in the lower body was taboo, something to be endured rather than treated. Even when the infection spread to the bloodstream, many kept quiet until it was too late. Doctors treated symptoms without addressing causes, and hospitals lacked both resources and empathy. Hygiene had turned from a personal ritual into a dangerous gamble. The psychological toll was as real as the physical, the shame of smelling unclean, of being unable to control one's body, haunted many women. They avoided sitting close to others, feared standing near men, and carried an invisible sense of guilt. The odour of infection clung to them, even when they tried to mask it with perfume or vinegar. That faint scent of rot became an unspoken secret shared among women who had no choice but to live with it. The human need for dignity clashed daily with the body's betrayal. After the war, when sanitary pads and soaps became available again, the damage was already done. Many women suffered long-term effects, chronic inflammation, scarring, and even infertility. The return of soft fabrics and clean water brought both relief and grief. Touching new cotton for the first time felt almost holy, as if forgiveness had taken a physical form. But along with comfort came memories of the years spent bleeding and scratching in silence. Hygiene had been something they fought for, not something they simply maintained. For future generations, those memories faded into whispers. Mothers rarely spoke of what they endured, ashamed of the things they had to do to stay clean. But the legacy of pain lived on in their cautious movements, in the way they taught their daughters to wash carefully, to stay dry, to value every drop of clean water. The lessons came without stories, only warnings. Beneath those quiet instructions lay a history of suffering too intimate to tell. The rough rags and crumbling newspapers left more than physical scars. They reshaped how women understood their bodies. Cleanliness had turned into punishment, and pain into a habit. In a world where every act of survival demanded sacrifice, even washing became a small war fought against one's own flesh. The desperation that led women to use rags and paper would soon lead them to try something even more shocking. Out of both necessity and belief, they would turn to a substance everyone possessed, one that seemed harmless but carried dangers no one wanted to see. Urine was one of the few liquids women could find when medicine ran out. In makeshift clinics and crowded shelters, it was whispered about as a natural disinfectant, something simple and available when nothing else existed. The idea came from old folk remedies, passed down through generations, claiming that urine could cleanse wounds and prevent infection. Desperation made people believe it. When a woman cut her hand or developed a rash, she might soak a cloth in her own urine, pressing it gently against the skin. The warmth gave a false sense of comfort, and for a moment it felt like healing. But the relief never lasted. Beneath that belief in purity hid something far more dangerous. Most women had no medical supplies. The war had drained pharmacies and hospitals, leaving civilians with superstition as their only tool. In some camps, nurses even encouraged the practice, citing the sterile nature of fresh urine. But what reached the wounds was rarely clean. The body of a malnourished, dehydrated woman produced waste that carried bacteria and toxins. Applying it to open skin only deepened the infection. Still, people clung to the ritual because it felt like control. It is cruelly absurd to think that survival once depended on convincing oneself that urine could take the place of medicine. In hospitals overwhelmed by casualties, urine became part of improvisation. Some doctors, faced with too many wounds and too few antiseptics, used it to rinse minor cuts or burns. The smell lingered in wards where bleach had long since run out. Sheets were stained with both blood and the pale yellow marks of futile cleansing. Women who volunteered as nurses followed orders without question. To refuse seemed ungrateful when others had nothing. The line between care and harm blurred until it vanished completely. At home, the same practice spread quietly. Mothers used it to treat their children's rashes, believing it harmless. Old women said it had worked in the past, so younger ones followed. They filled bowls with the first morning urine, as that was said to be the purest. The liquid cooled quickly, leaving a sharp smell that mixed with the dampness of unwashed rooms. The skin burned slightly where it was applied, a sting mistaken for healing. Within days, small wounds turned red, then black. Some women tried to hide the smell by adding herbs or salt, but nothing masked it. If compared to modern antiseptics, it would be like replacing alcohol with sewage and calling it medicine. The infections that followed were silent at first. Itching turned to swelling, swelling to pus. Skin peeled away from wounds, leaving raw flesh exposed. Those who lived in camps or factories often ignored the pain until it spread too far. The body's signals were easy to overlook when everything already hurt. Fever came suddenly, and many collapsed without knowing why. Without antibiotics, the infections travelled through the bloodstream, reaching the heart or lungs. The price of false healing was death that arrived slowly, without warning. In conversations among women, the subject was rarely mentioned. Shame surrounded it. Admitting to using urine for cleaning felt primitive, even to those who had done it. They justified it as a necessity, not a belief, though deep down they wanted to believe in its power. Hope was easier than despair. The body, after all, had to rely on itself when the world abandoned it. I find it haunting that faith in the body's waste became the last line of defense for people stripped of every resource. Some tried boiling the urine, hoping heat would make it safer. Others mixed it with ashes, flour, or vinegar, creating pastes that smelled foul but promised miracles. Women applied these to cracked heels, infected nails, and sores caused by constant friction. None of it worked. The combination of dirt, sweat, and false remedies turned their bodies into breeding grounds for bacteria. The smell of ammonia followed them, clinging to clothes and bedsheets. In crowded rooms, no one dared to ask where it came from. Everyone knew. Medical records after the war describe mysterious infections common among women. The reports avoided mentioning urine directly, but the symptoms told the truth: necrotic skin, chronic ulcers, and burns caused by chemical irritation. The irony was sharp. What was supposed to be clean had instead been destroyed. Some survivors remembered being told by nurses that it was all they had. Others recalled doctors turning away when asked for something better. The war had not only stripped people of medicine, it had stripped them of dignity. When peace returned, the stories of urine therapy faded quickly. No one wanted to remember or admit how far desperation had gone. The new generation of doctors dismissed it as a rumour, though traces of the practice survived in old households for decades. Women who had once trusted the remedy now shuddered at the memory of the smell. The shame clung to them longer than the infection. Clean water and soap finally replaced superstition, but the scars remained, hidden beneath sleeves and silence. The belief in urine as a healer was never about science. It was about survival. When the body is all one has left, even its waste becomes sacred. The women who used it were not foolish, only human. They reached for what was near, trying to soothe pain in a world where everything hurt. But their effort left behind a warning written in wounds that hope without truth can be as deadly as neglect itself. The act of using urine to heal turned the body against itself, making every small injury a potential threat. The following stories would reveal that this was not the worst of it. For even something as simple as a cloth or towel meant to clean and comfort would become another silent weapon against women's health, spreading sickness through the very hands that sought purity. Handkerchiefs were supposed to represent civility, a small token of cleanliness tucked into a woman's pocket or apron. During the war, that fragile symbol lost all meaning. The same piece of cloth that once dabbed perfume or wiped away tears became a multi-purpose tool for survival. Women used it to clean their faces, wipe sweat, dry dishes, and cover their mouths from smoke or dust. It was washed rarely, if ever. Water was rationed, soap was scarce, and the cloth absorbed everything: the oil of the skin, the grease of food, and the grime of labour. By the end of each week, the fabric was stiff with residue, yet still used as if it were clean. The habit came from necessity, not neglect. There was simply no time or means to separate what was personal from what was practical. A single cloth had to serve every function, becoming an invisible carrier of bacteria. Women wiped their faces after working in factories filled with smoke, then later used the same cloth to clean dishes or cradle a child's cheek. The line between hygiene and contamination disappeared completely. It feels disturbingly ironic that the object meant to keep one clean became the very thing spreading disease across their own skin. Skin infections began quietly. Small red spots appeared along the cheeks and chin, mistaken for irritation. Soon they grew into painful boils that oozed under the heat. The pores, clogged with sweat and dirt, became perfect places for infection to thrive. Some women tried rubbing the spots with vinegar or salt, hoping the sting meant healing, but it only worsened the wounds. The face, once a symbol of self-respect, became covered in scars and peeling skin. If compared to modern routines, it would be like washing one's face with a kitchen rag dipped in dirty water and believing it restored beauty. The smell of the handkerchiefs was familiar, an odd mix of sweat, soap residue, and decay. No amount of air drying could erase it. Women carried the cloths in their pockets or tucked them into the waistbands of dresses, using them constantly through the day. They wiped dust from their eyes, then later wiped grease from cookware. The repetition made the act automatic, something done without thought. In a world where everything was contaminated, nothing truly felt unclean anymore. The nose adapted, the mind ignored, and life went on. In crowded homes and shelters, handkerchiefs were sometimes shared. A mother passed hers to a daughter, or friends used the same cloth to cool their foreheads during a fever. Illness spreads easily. Fungal infections began to creep across faces and necks, turning patches of skin red and flaky. Women called it war rash and accepted it as part of life. Some developed severe dermatitis from constant contact with unwashed fabric. But there were no dermatologists, no creams, no clean towels to start over with. To suffer quietly was expected. I find it deeply unsettling how silence itself became the first form of infection, spreading faster than any germ. The lack of fresh water made washing impossible. Even when rain fell, women saved it for drinking or cooking. The handkerchiefs were only rinsed occasionally in grey water, leaving traces of ash and soap scum embedded in the fibres. They were hung to dry indoors, where smoke from coal fires gave them a permanent yellow tinge. Some tried rubbing them with flour or starch to make them feel less greasy, though it only sealed the dirt deeper. Over time, the clothes grew thin and frayed, yet they remained in use until they fell apart. The idea of throwing them away was unimaginable. Waste was a sin, survival required making do. As infections spread, the skin began to change texture. Patches of fungus appeared around the nose, mouth, and ears. The itching was constant, but scratching only spread it further. Many women stopped looking in mirrors altogether. They no longer recognized their own faces. The skin they had once powdered and cared for was now raw and uneven. The smell of mildew lingered faintly, mixed with the sour trace of sweat. The face became a map of endurance, marked by every day spent surviving without true cleanliness. Doctors who examined women after the war noted how common facial scarring had become. They attributed it to malnutrition, but many scars had deeper origins, infections caused by contact with dirty fabrics. Some women bore small craters across their cheeks. Others had dark stains that never faded. They carried those marks long after peace returned, reminders of the invisible violence of filth. The body had absorbed the war in ways no weapon could show. When soap and clean towels finally became available again, the simple act of washing felt like a ceremony. Women boiled their handkerchiefs, watched the water turn brown, and wept at the sight. The smell of soap and steam filled their rooms like a blessing. Some kept the old rags as proof of survival, folded neatly in drawers they never opened again. The fabric had witnessed too much, the sweat of labour, the oil of skin, the tears of exhaustion. The humble handkerchief, once a symbol of grace, had become a silent accomplice to suffering. It touched faces with care but carried sickness in its threads. It absorbed tears but gave back scars. Cleanliness, during those years, was not about appearance, but about the desperate attempt to feel human again. The worn cloths that once touched lips and eyes left behind more than dirt. They told a story of how deeply neglect had entered daily life. What came after would reveal that even the skin itself, stripped and inflamed, could no longer defend against the world around it, and the face that once tried to stay clean would begin to darken, wrinkle, and erode under conditions no one was prepared to face. The faces of women during the war told stories that no photograph could capture. Under the constant haze of smoke, ash, and fatigue, skin lost all traces of softness. The glow once associated with youth and care vanished, replaced by dullness and uneven colour. Day after day, faces were exposed to bomb dust, coal smoke, and the grime of factory air. Vitamin deficiency drained their complexions of life, leaving behind a greyish tone that no powder could hide. The war had turned beauty into a memory, something impractical and faintly absurd in a world where survival left no room for vanity. Cosmetics disappeared from stores almost overnight. Every jar of cream, every bar of scented soap was redirected to soldiers or hoarded in secret. Women improvised, rubbing animal fat or oil on their faces to fight dryness. The smell lingered, a mix of grease and smoke that never washed off completely. Dust clung to it easily, settling into pores. Within weeks, many women developed rough patches that cracked and flaked. It feels almost darkly poetic that the same faces used in propaganda posters as symbols of hope were, in reality, lined with exhaustion and soot. Sunlight was no relief either. Without sunscreen, the skin burned quickly, then peeled, leaving uneven marks that darkened over time. Outdoor labourers suffered the worst. Factory workers who spent hours near furnaces or open fires developed permanent redness across their cheeks and foreheads. Others, trapped in shelters for months, emerged with skin so pale and fragile it tore at the slightest touch. The war erased colour not only from their cities but from their bodies. If compared to modern beauty routines, it would be like living without mirrors, creams, or rest, and calling survival itself a form of makeup. Pollution turned even simple air into poison. Every breath carried dust from collapsed buildings and soot from engines. The skin absorbed it all, clogging pores and dulling the surface. Washing did little to help. With water limited and soap harsh, cleansing stripped away natural oils, leaving the face raw and tight. Some women rinsed with cold tea or rainwater, believing it would soften their skin. Others rubbed breadcrumbs or oatmeal across their cheeks to exfoliate. Nothing truly worked. Each method left the face feeling scraped rather than cleaned. The lack of nutrition deepened the damage. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare, replaced by tinned goods with no vitamins left. The deficiency showed quickly. Lips cracked until they bled. The corners of the mouth split open and refused to heal. Skin around the eyes darkened into permanent shadows. The soft lines of youth turned sharp, carved by stress and hunger. Women who had once taken pride in their appearance now looked years older. Mirrors became reminders of everything the war had stolen. I find it quietly tragic how the reflection of a woman's face became a record of deprivation rather than identity. Bombing raids worsened the decay. Each night spent in underground shelters filled with smoke and sweat aged the skin faster. Air was thick with soot and fear. Women slept sitting up, pressed against walls, faces against fabric soaked with condensation. The combination of dirt and moisture created the perfect breeding ground for fungus. Some developed rashes that spread from their necks to their cheeks, forming dark spots that never faded. In daylight, the marks looked like bruises, as if the war itself had left fingerprints on their skin. In photographs from the era, the lighting hides most of this damage. Smooth faces were painted onto posters and magazines, showing women as radiant symbols of endurance. The reality beneath was far different. Those smiles masked peeling skin, broken veins, and burns from cooking fires. Makeup, when available, was used not for beauty but for concealment. Thick powder hid infections, rouge disguised anemia, and lipstick became the only colour left in a grey world. But under the surface, the damage deepened with every passing day. Some women tried home remedies to save their skin. They rubbed potato slices to reduce dark spots or applied honey diluted with water for moisture. Others massaged ashes mixed with oil, hoping to cleanse impurities. The results were often worse than the problem itself. Ash burned the skin, oil clogged pores, and the lack of proper washing made everything fester. Still, they persisted. Beauty was not about vanity anymore. It was about memory. To care for one's face, even for a few minutes, was to feel human again. When peace finally returned, mirrors reflected faces that no longer matched the past. The once bright skin of youth had turned sallow and lined. Freckles from sun exposure blended with patches of discoloration. Many women suffered from long-term conditions, fungal infections that never healed, permanent redness from burns, and deep wrinkles formed by worry. Doctors called it war skin, a term that captured both the physical and emotional toll. No cream could erase it. The damage was etched too deeply, carved by years of smoke, hunger, and sleepless nights. After the war, beauty advertisements filled the streets again, promising to restore radiance and erase fatigue. But those who had lived through it looked at such slogans with quiet disbelief. They knew that no lotion could restore what had been lost. Their faces were not flawed. They were records of endurance. The scars, the darkness, the roughness were proof that they had survived when softness had no place in the world. The faces that once turned toward the sun without fear now bore the permanent shadow of war. What came next would reveal that the decay did not end with the surface. Beneath the damaged skin, another silent danger was spreading, one that began with unwashed hands and ended in the quiet sickness that took years to understand. Hands, once symbols of care and work, became silent carriers of death during the war. There was no soap, no clean water, and no separation between the living and the dead. Women used their hands for everything: feeding children, tending wounds, cleaning waste, and burying bodies. In refugee camps and bombed cities, there were no sinks, no basins, no buckets reserved for washing. Water belonged first to the thirsty. Hygiene was an afterthought, an impossible luxury. The hands that once braided hair and kneaded bread now held filth, and no one could afford to notice. In the chaos of daily survival, people forgot the meaning of cleanliness. Latrines overflowed, and flies gathered around them in thick clouds. Women relieved themselves in corners or behind collapsed walls, wiping with scraps of cloth or leaves. When they returned, they touched their faces, their clothes, their children, without thinking, without rinsing. The smallest act, such as feeding a baby or breaking bread, carried invisible danger. It feels almost unbearable to imagine that a gesture of love could so easily turn into an act of infection. Diseases spread quietly through hands that never rested. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera thrived where soap was unknown. Every touch became a risk. The same hands that prepared food also tended the sick and cleaned the dying. When someone died, women were the ones who handled the bodies, wiping them down, straightening their limbs, closing their eyes. They did it gently, reverently, and then turned back to care for the living with the same hands. There was no choice. Death and life were handled by the same touch. If compared to modern standards, it would be like performing surgery, cooking dinner, and burying the dead without ever washing once. In crowded shelters, the problem worsened. People lived shoulder to shoulder, sharing blankets and utensils. Food was served from large pots, scooped by bare hands or dented ladles. Children reached for bread. Mothers broke it with fingers already coated in dirt. Flies hovered constantly, drawn by the scent of sweat and rot. The air itself seemed contaminated. Everyone knew it was dangerous, but no one had the strength to care. A few drops of water might have saved lives, but thirst always came first. The human body adapted, but only for a while. Skin cracked from dryness and exposure, forming small cuts where bacteria entered easily. Nails blackened with grime, and the smell of sweat and decay lingered under them. Hands took on a permanent grey colour, stained by earth, ash, and blood. Some women wrapped rags around their fingers to hide the filth, but it only made things worse. The fabric trapped moisture, feeding infections that spread slowly up their arms. They scratched constantly, tearing at their own skin until it bled. I find it quietly horrifying that survival demanded using the same hands for tenderness and contamination, as if care and decay had merged into one. Doctors and nurses faced the same struggle. Hospitals ran out of gloves, and disinfectant was rationed. They washed their hands in the same basin all day, until the water turned cloudy and useless. Still, they continued, dipping their fingers again and again, telling themselves it was enough. In makeshift clinics, even the illusion of cleanliness was better than admitting defeat. Many medical workers fell ill themselves, their dedication punished by the very acts of care they performed. Among civilians, superstition filled the gaps where science could not. Some believed that wiping hands on straw or rubbing them with ash would purify them. Others dipped fingers into vinegar, thinking the sting meant safety. These gestures did little to stop disease but offered comfort, a fragile illusion of control in a world collapsing under invisible threats. Women passed such habits to one another in whispers, calling them old remedies, though no one remembered where they came from. Children suffered the most. Their mothers handled food, soothed fevers, and wiped tears with unwashed hands. The germs passed from skin to mouth, from mouth to gut. Diarrhea spread rapidly through camps, weakening already hungry bodies. Many mothers buried their children without realizing that the same touch that comforted them in life had carried death into their small bodies. The guilt of such ignorance never left them. It lingered long after the graves were covered. After the war, when running water returned and soap filled shelves again, many women developed a strange fear of dirt. They scrubbed their hands until they bled, washing dozens of times a day. The memory of invisible contamination haunted them. Even the faint smell of earth or sweat triggered panic. What had once been neglect turned into obsession. Cleanliness became a form of prayer, a way to ask forgiveness for the lives they could not save. The hands of war carried the story of humanity at its most fragile. They worked, fed, touched, healed, and buried. They bore witness to survival and to contamination, to love that killed and labour that sickened. In their lines and scars lay the truth of a time when water was more precious than health. The hands that could no longer distinguish care from contagion marked the beginning of a deeper decay. What came after would show how the same neglect that killed through touch would soon rot from within, as mouths and teeth, fed by those unwashed hands, became the next site of suffering that no one could ignore. Dental care nearly vanished from women's lives during the war. Toothbrushes were rare, toothpaste almost mythical, and dentistry was a luxury reserved for soldiers or the rich. Most civilians had nothing but desperation and habit. They cleaned their mouths with what they could find: small sticks, scraps of cloth, or even their own fingers. Pieces of wood were chewed until soft and used as makeshift brushes. Fingers wrapped in rags rubbed over teeth in circular motions, scraping away little and spreading more. The mouth, once a place of care and intimacy, turned into a quiet chamber of decay. Morning routines disappeared. There was no fresh mint, no soap, no glass of clean water. Women woke with bitter mouths and dry tongues, tasting the residue of sleep and smoke. They rubbed their teeth with salt or ashes, believing the sting meant purity. The burn of salt became familiar, almost comforting, because it was something, anything, to fight the rot. It is almost darkly ironic that pain became the only proof of cleanliness. Many continued out of superstition, convinced that a burning mouth was a healthy one. For many, wood was the only tool. They used twigs from fruit trees, peeled of bark, their ends chewed into fibrous tips. The texture felt rough but effective, scratching off grime while spreading splinters. Some mixed baking soda with water to rub along the gum line, though the gritty powder cut the surface and caused bleeding. The taste of metal followed, faint but constant, a reminder that blood had replaced mint as the scent of oral care. If compared to today, it would be like cleaning teeth with sand and thinking it was hygiene. Yet, it was the only option in a world stripped bare. Malnutrition worsened everything. With no fresh fruits or vegetables, gums weakened, teeth loosened, and infections grew deep within the jaw. Vitamin C was almost impossible to find, and scurvy became common. Women complained of aching gums that bled whenever they ate. The pain was dull but relentless, like a low hum under every meal. Some lost teeth one by one, swallowing them by accident while chewing hard bread. Others woke to find them lying loose on the pillow. By the age of 30, many mouths were half empty, the remaining teeth stained black and chipped. The breath carried the scent of decay, sour and metallic. In crowded rooms, people turned their heads slightly when speaking. The air between them was thick with rot and smoke. Women tried to hide the smell with herbs, parsley, cloves, even burnt coffee grounds, but nothing helped for long. Each exhale carried the memory of neglect. Some joked bitterly that it matched the rest of their lives dry, harsh, and impossible to sweeten. I find it deeply unsettling that something as intimate as a breath could turn into a constant reminder of poverty. Dentists were nearly non-existent for civilians. In cities, clinics were bombed or requisitioned by the military. In rural areas, there had never been any to begin with. When a toothache struck, the only remedy was extraction by force. Women tied strings to door handles or let friends pull with pliers sterilized in boiling water, if they were lucky enough to have any. The screams were muffled behind blankets, but everyone heard. The silence that followed was worse. The absence of pain meant the loss of another tooth, another small piece of the self gone forever. Some resorted to more desperate measures. They packed holes with wax or cloth to block the air. Others pressed cold metal spoons against swollen gums to numb the ache. Vinegar, alcohol, or even urine was used to rinse the mouth, stinging wounds and spreading more infection. The line between treatment and torture blurred completely. Teeth broke under the strain of chewing rations too hard to bite, and the gums receded into purple ridges. Yet, life went on. People learned to smile with closed lips, not out of modesty but shame. The lack of oral hygiene extended to children as well. Without clean water or proper food, they grew up with rotting teeth before adolescence. Mothers wiped their mouths with the same cloths used for dishes or faces, unaware of the harm. By adulthood, the pattern was set. Pain became normal, decay inevitable. In photos from the era, people rarely smiled widely, and if they did, it was with their lips pressed together. Teeth had become private things, best kept hidden. After the war, when toothpaste and toothbrushes reappeared on shelves, many women could no longer use them. Their gums were too sensitive, their teeth too few. Dentists described entire generations with the same condition, jawbones shrinking, infections spreading into sinuses, breath sour even in old age. The cost of neglect had calcified into their bodies. Cleanliness could be restored, but not reversed. The damage was permanent, carved into smiles that would never return. The mouth, once a symbol of expression and speech, had turned into a graveyard of small losses. Each tooth gone was another quiet record of deprivation, another sign that survival had replaced care. Clean mouths were for those who had time to live, the rest only endured. The quiet rot behind their smiles was not only physical but symbolic. It revealed how deeply the war had invaded every gesture, every bite, every word, and while the decay of teeth could be seen, the rot that began to spread within the mind, fed by fatigue, hunger, and despair, was something no one could brush away. Privacy vanished first, long before comfort or beauty. For women working through the war, personal hygiene became something done in secret, rushed, and half-finished. Factories never slept, and neither did the people inside them. Women worked beside roaring machines that vibrated through the walls, the air thick with dust, oil, and sweat. When the shift ended, they simply moved to a corner of the same building, lay down on the floor or an empty crate, and closed their eyes. There were no showers, no sinks, no quiet moments for care. The body never left work, it simply collapsed where it stood. The factories themselves smelled of iron and grease. Water was rationed, so it was saved for cooling machines, not for washing people. Women wiped themselves with dirty rags or bits of paper, trying to remove the grime from their skin. The air stuck to them, turning every pore into a small prison of sweat and dust. When they washed, it was with cold water from buckets or with the rain that slipped through broken roofs. Soap was a memory. Warm water, a fantasy. It feels both tragic and absurd that survival forced people to treat their bodies like tools, wiped, not washed, repaired, not rested. In military camps, conditions were worse. The toilets were little more than open trenches, and the washing areas were shared. Curtains hung loosely from ropes, offering the illusion of privacy but none of its safety. Women bathed in silence, eyes fixed downward, aware of every sound beyond the thin walls. They learned to wash quickly, sometimes in complete darkness, their hands trembling with cold. Modesty was impossible, dignity was optional. Many stopped caring altogether. They washed only when they could smell themselves, and even then, only enough to continue working. If compared to modern life, it would be like living in a world where the concept of being alone simply did not exist. The lack of time became its own cruelty. Each day was divided into work, ration lines, and sleep. Hygiene fit nowhere in between. A few minutes to wash meant losing time to eat or rest. Women cleaned themselves in fragments, hands at 1 hour, feet at another, face when possible. Some wiped sweat from their necks with their sleeves, others rubbed dust from their skin with bread crusts or newspaper. It was less a routine than a desperate attempt to feel human amid exhaustion. The noise made privacy even harder to imagine. Machines clanged, boots echoed, planes droned overhead. Even when the world outside was quiet, the body hummed with the rhythm of work. Silence became suspicious, and stillness felt wrong. Women slept in their clothes, their hair tied back, their hands still blackened by grease. The line between day and night, between work and rest, blurred until it disappeared. The body no longer belonged to the person it carried, it belonged to the war. In refugee shelters, hundreds of people shared the same space. Families were packed into single rooms where cooking, sleeping, and washing all happened together. The smell of unwashed skin mixed with food, fuel, and illness. Women turned their backs to the room and wiped themselves under their clothes with damp rags, pretending not to notice the stares that sometimes followed. It was a routine born of shame and necessity. They cleaned just enough to remove the worst of the dirt, then covered the rest. Cleanliness became a performance, an illusion for others rather than comfort for oneself. I find it quietly devastating that the act of washing, once private and tender, became something done in fear of being seen. The consequences were slow but relentless. Skin diseases spread through factories and shelters alike. Fungal infections grew where clothing stayed wet for too long. Some women developed sores under their arms or between their thighs that refused to heal. The smell of sweat mixed with infection became part of the air, something no one mentioned but everyone noticed. Doctors wrote it off as the price of hard work, offering little more than advice to keep dry, though staying dry was impossible. For many women, modesty itself began to fade from memory. In a world that exposed them to everything, from bombings to hunger to exhaustion, the idea of privacy felt childish. They bathed beside strangers, dressed beside men, and learned not to flinch when someone entered. Shame dulled into numbness. When the war ended, some admitted they no longer knew how to feel alone. Even silence made them uneasy. The body, trained to hurry and hide, did not know how to relax. When peace returned, the reappearance of bathrooms felt almost unreal. The sound of running water seemed luxurious. For the first time in years, women could stand under a stream and let dirt fall away without rushing. Some wept, not from joy but from disbelief. Cleanliness felt like a gift they no longer deserved. It took months, sometimes years, before they stopped washing in silence or glancing over their shoulders. The war had not only taken their homes and families, it had taken their right to privacy. The absence of solitude left marks deeper than any scar. It shaped how women saw their bodies, their value, and their boundaries. They learned to hide even when no one was watching, to move quickly even when no one was chasing. Hygiene had once been a form of self-respect. Now it was a brief, mechanical act of survival. The loss of privacy was not the end of their ordeal. The neglect of the body soon gave way to something worse, the breakdown of the systems within it. Without rest, nutrition, or care, fertility itself began to vanish, leaving behind a generation of women whose wounds were not visible, but just as irreversible. Infertility became one of the quietest and most permanent wounds of the war. It was not caused by bombs or bullets, but by the slow, invisible decay of the body under neglect. Women lived through years of infection, exhaustion, and malnutrition without medical care. Their bodies bore the burden of survival until there was nothing left to give. What began as small, untreated inflammations grew into deep infections that scarred them from within. By the time peace arrived, many realized the cost of endurance. Life had continued, but new life could not. In makeshift shelters and factories, there were no doctors, no clean instruments, and no privacy. Women treated pain with home remedies, ashes, vinegar, herbs, or even urine, believing they were helping. Each attempt worsened the damage. Infections in the lower abdomen spread upward, scarring the uterus and fallopian tubes. Fever became a familiar companion, a constant ache behind the ribs. When the pain faded, it was not because healing had come, but because the body had surrendered. It is bitterly tragic that the same strength that kept women alive also silenced their pain until it was too late. Menstruation became a battle of its own. Without sanitary supplies, women used anything absorbent: rags, straw, paper, even leaves. These makeshift materials were rarely cleaned, and bacteria flourished in the dampness. What should have been a monthly inconvenience turned into a source of infection that returned again and again. Many developed pelvic inflammatory disease, though they did not know the name for it. They called it the fever, or simply the burning, and learned to live with it. If compared to modern times, it would be like being told to treat a wound with mouldy fabric and hoping faith would replace medicine. Abortion during wartime carried even greater danger. Hunger, rape, and desperation drove many women to end pregnancies using crude tools or herbal poisons. There were no doctors, no anesthesia, and no sterile instruments. Some used knitting needles or wooden sticks. Others swallowed mixtures of unknown plants. Those who survived the procedure often developed fatal infections. The uterus, once a place of creation, became a chamber of injury. Even when they lived, many were left barren. The silence surrounding these deaths was almost complete. No graves, no records, no acknowledgement. The lack of gynecological care was nearly absolute. Hospitals prioritised soldiers, not civilians. Medical wards for women were converted into military wings, and the doctors who remained lacked both supplies and time. Women lined up outside clinics, waiting for hours only to be turned away. When they did receive treatment, it was often too late. Simple infections became lifelong conditions. The body became both battlefield and casualty, its wounds hidden under layers of clothing and shame. I find it quietly devastating that the very organ meant to nurture life became a site of so much suffering. Malnutrition deepened the damage. Without vitamins or protein, the body could not heal itself. Periods stopped for months or years, and when they returned, they brought pain so sharp it bent women double. The thinness of their bodies mirrored the emptiness inside. Doctors after the war recorded countless cases of ovarian failure, though they rarely connected it to years of deprivation. For women, infertility was rarely treated as a tragedy. It was simply one more consequence to accept in silence. The mental toll was just as severe. Women who had dreamed of families found themselves unable to conceive. Some blamed themselves, others believed they were cursed. In societies still bound by tradition, infertility was seen as failure, not injury. Many marriages ended quietly, the husband leaving without explanation. Others stayed together but lived in quiet grief, their homes filled with a silence heavier than any loss. Those who did manage to bear children often faced complications, miscarriages, or stillbirths. The human body, pushed past endurance, no longer remembered how to begin again. After the war, governments rarely acknowledged the issue. There were medals for bravery, but none for survival. The stories of infertility were told only between women, whispered during laundry or over kitchen tables. They compared symptoms in hushed tones, finding comfort in shared pain. Some tried to adopt, others resigned themselves to caring for nieces and nephews. The wombs that had carried the burden of hunger, infection, and sorrow had nothing left for the future. Doctors who studied the phenomenon later called it silent infertility. It did not announce itself with visible scars or bleeding, only absence, the absence of menstruation, of conception, of growth. The damage lay hidden, invisible even to those who carried it. The war had ended, but inside countless women, the fighting continued, in fevers that flared and pains that never faded. Medicine would later describe it with cold precision, but for those who lived through it, it was simply another loss they were told to bear. Infertility after the war was not just a medical condition, it was a mirror reflecting how deeply neglect had entered women's lives. Their bodies had been used, ignored, and pushed beyond recovery. Yet even in their brokenness, they carried the memory of care, of wanting to protect something gentle in a world that had none. The emptiness left behind was not silent. It lingered in the small gestures of daily life, in the way women touched their bellies absent-mindedly, in the way they looked at children with both love and distance. The war had ended, but its consequences lived quietly inside them, shaping generations that would never know the price their mothers paid. The loss of fertility was more than a tragedy of biology. It was the theft of continuity itself, and from that loss, women learned a new kind of endurance, one that did not create life but preserved it in memory, even as the world demanded they move on without ever truly healing. The war had stripped everything from women, including the small luxuries of care. Moisturizers, oils, and lotions were long forgotten, replaced by ration cards and desperation. The air was dry with smoke and dust, and winter winds cut the skin until it cracked. In that harshness, women turned to whatever they could find, and cooking oil, dark, reused, and smelling faintly of burnt food, became their closest thing to a beauty product. It was not vanity, it was survival disguised as care. When there was no soap, no cream, and no comfort, a few drops of used oil could at least soften the pain of dry skin. They scooped it from pans after frying potatoes or fish, pouring it carefully into small jars. The colour was cloudy brown, with crumbs floating inside, but no one cared. The warmth of it against their palms felt like mercy. They rubbed it on their elbows, their faces, even their scalps, trying to trap moisture before it disappeared into the cold air. The smell lingered: fried meat, smoke, and iron. But in a world where everything smelled of smoke and metal, it no longer mattered. It is oddly tragic that what once filled kitchens with the comfort of food became the only balm for survival. The oil clung to everything. It soaked into hair, making it heavy and greasy. Strands stuck together in dull clumps that caught the dust from the streets. Flakes of soot settled on oily skin, turning it grey. But women persisted, because the alternative was worse. Cracks in the skin that bled, scalps that itched until they bled, lips that split in the cold. Even the smallest drop of oil gave relief. In factories, they rubbed it on their hands between shifts, hoping it would protect them from machine grease. It didn't, but it gave them something to do with their tired hands, a ritual that made them feel human again. In the countryside, women made their own versions. They mixed old oil with animal fat or ashes, believing it gave strength to the skin. Some boiled the mixture, adding herbs when they could find them. The result was thick, sticky, and foul-smelling, but it softened the skin for a few hours. Others applied it to their hair as a mask, wrapping their heads in scarves to hide the shine. They said it made the hair obedient, though what it really did was suffocate it. If compared to modern times, it would be like moisturizing with the leftovers of a frying pan and calling it skincare. The skin reacted in cruel ways. Pores clogged, infections spread, and the warmth of the oil fed bacteria that thrived in darkness. Small red bumps appeared first, then patches of fungus that grew like a quiet map of survival across necks and arms. The smell followed them, sour and rancid, a mixture of sweat and cooking. Yet no one mocked or questioned it, because everyone shared the same odour of decay and endurance. In bomb shelters, the air was so thick with oil and fear that people stopped noticing either. For women, this strange ritual became a symbol of stubborn care. They could not wash or heal, but they could at least soften what the war had hardened. Each time they rubbed oil into their skin, they were fighting against the slow erosion of self. It was not vanity, but defiance, a quiet refusal to let the world make them rough and dry like the earth beneath their feet. I can't help but feel that these women, rubbing used oil into cracked skin, were holding on to something sacred, even if they no longer remembered why. But the consequences grew worse with time. Skin infections deepened, and rashes turned to sores. In some places, the smell of rancid oil drew flies that buzzed through sleeping quarters. Hair fell out in clumps, weighed down by grease. Doctors, when available, warned against it, but their words were hollow in a world where there were no alternatives. The choice was between pain or stench, between cracked skin or rot. Women chose the latter because it at least looked alive. The oil left stains on clothes, pillows, and sheets, when there were sheets at all. Some women avoided touching their children after applying it, afraid to spread the rash. Others rubbed the same oil onto the faces of their babies, whispering it would protect them from the wind. The act was passed down like a ritual, born of desperation and faith. Generations later, some women still remembered their mother's hands, smelling faintly of burnt oil and smoke, touching their cheeks with impossible tenderness. When the war ended, new products appeared: creams, soaps, powders. The shelves that had once been empty now overflowed with choices, but many women hesitated to use them. Their skin had grown accustomed to rough care, their senses dulled to rancid smells. The first time they held a clean bottle of lotion, some cried. Others laughed, rubbing it onto their arms and marvelling at the faint floral scent. It felt unreal, as if softness itself had been rationed and suddenly returned. Yet, even then, a few continued using cooking oil, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear that comfort could vanish again. The story of those small jars of used oil is not one of beauty but of endurance. It tells how far people will go to feel alive, to hold on to a piece of themselves when the world demands they give it up. It was never about looking better. It was about not falling apart entirely. The oil may have trapped dirt and spread disease, but in its sticky embrace, women found a strange form of comfort, a reminder that even in ruin, care was still possible, however crude, however foul. And long after the war ended, that scent of burnt oil would remain, carried in memory as the smell of both survival and surrender. The problem of waste was one of the most silent and humiliating aspects of wartime life for women. There were no proper places to dispose of used rags, cloths, or paper soaked in blood, in camps, shelters, and bombed towns. Every space was meant for survival, not dignity. Women bled quietly, washed what they could, and when the cloths were too soiled to reuse, they hid them behind tents, under debris, or in corners of ruined buildings. The smell was thick in the air, mixed with rot and smoke, but people learned to ignore it. The war had taught them to stop noticing anything that wasn't an explosion or a cry for help. The makeshift disposal areas behind shelters grew into small piles of decay. Used cloth stiffened in the cold, darkened by dirt and blood, while flies swarmed above them. In the summer, the stench became unbearable, yet no one spoke of it. Women were expected to manage it on their own, just as they managed hunger, fear, and exhaustion. It is both absurd and cruel that the same society capable of building bombs could not provide a bucket for women to bleed into. When it rained, the filth spread through the ground, running into drainage or wells. Rats came first, followed by insects. In some camps, diseases spread so fast that even soldiers fell ill. Officials blamed poor hygiene but never questioned why women had nowhere clean to dispose of their waste. The act of menstruation, already seen as shameful, became a public hazard. Mothers warned their daughters to bury the rags deeper, to hide the smell, to avoid shame. But the earth itself had grown too shallow to contain it all. In rural areas, women dug small holes behind barns or near ditches. They covered the waste with soil or ash, praying it would not be found by animals. In cities, where there was no ground to dig, they threw it into rivers or burned it in secret. The smoke carried a strange, sour odour that mixed with the burning coal and trash of daily survival. It was a hidden ritual of filth, repeated by millions of women who had no other choice. If compared to modern times, it would be like every woman being forced to throw her used pads into the street and pretend it was normal. Some soldiers who stumbled across these piles mocked them. Others avoided the area altogether. A few women were punished for creating disorder when their waste was discovered near shared quarters. The humiliation was unbearable. They cried quietly at night, ashamed not of their bodies but of the world that made them feel unclean for having one. To bleed in wartime was to become a secret enemy of order. The body's natural rhythm was treated like an inconvenience to be hidden at all costs. The lack of clean water made everything worse. Women who tried to wash the rags found themselves using muddy water from puddles or drainage ditches. The stains never disappeared. The rags grew stiff and coarse, scraping the skin when reused. Some developed ulcers and rashes from the constant irritation, but there were no doctors to treat them. The suffering became part of routine life, bleeding, hiding, washing, reusing, and praying for the days to pass. In factories, the situation was no better. Women working on production lines had no access to toilets for hours. They bled into their clothes, trying to hide the stains with coats or aprons. The smell lingered, and embarrassment haunted them. But no one complained. Complaining could cost them their jobs, and their jobs were all they had. In war, even pain had to be efficient. The psychological toll of this silence was deep. Many women began to believe they were truly dirty, that their bodies were something to be ashamed of. When men joked about women's smells, they said nothing. They had no words left for anger. Their self-worth was buried under the rags they hid behind the tents. There is something profoundly unjust about a world that taught women to fear the proof that they were alive. The disposal problem also revealed how little women's needs were considered in wartime planning. Military camps had space for ammunition, food, and even pets, but not for menstrual waste. Every resource was designed for men. Even in civilian shelters, sanitation rules were written without a single thought for women's biology. When outbreaks occurred, reports mentioned unclean conditions without naming the true cause. It was as if the presence of women itself was an embarrassment best erased from record. When the war ended and sanitation standards returned, the memory of those years remained. Women still washed rags in secret, still avoided talking about menstruation. The habit of silence lingered long after the bombs stopped. For many, privacy never came back. They carried the shame like an invisible uniform, stitched into the way they walked and spoke. The waste piles behind the tents may have vanished, but their memory lived on, in the smell of rot that haunted dreams, in the fear of being seen as unclean, and in the unspoken bond among women who had endured it together. They had learned that even in a world torn apart by war, the body's simplest needs could still be too much to ask for. The story of those hidden piles is not one of disgust, but of neglect. It shows how easily humanity forgets half its people when writing the rules of survival. It was not filth that spread disease, but indifference, and it was not blood that shamed women, but the silence that surrounded it. When the night settled and the air cooled, the smell faded for a while, but in the stillness, the memory of it lingered, a reminder of how war stripped away not just comfort, but the very right to be clean. The story of the dirty underwear spread quietly among the nurses and doctors of a small field hospital. It began with a woman brought in with a fever that would not break. Her skin was pale, her breath shallow, and her body burned with infection. Supplies were scarce, medicines even scarcer. She was just another patient among dozens, another nameless body trembling in a cot. The doctors assumed she would die within days, but one nurse, while changing her clothes, noticed the undergarment she had worn for weeks, stained with dried blood, yellowed sweat, and traces of something darker. Against the smell and revulsion, the nurse decided to keep it for inspection. That act, born from disgust, saved her life. The doctor who examined the garment found something unusual. Among the stains were traces of pus and an odd, milky discharge that suggested more than a surface infection. He ordered an internal examination, something rarely done in wartime conditions. Beneath the fever and exhaustion, they found an ovarian cyst that had ruptured, leaking infection through her bloodstream. Surgery was risky, but without it, death was certain. The woman survived, barely. The doctor later said it was the filth that told the truth, what her own body had hidden beneath layers of pain and modesty. It is almost ironic that the dirtiest object in the room was the one that revealed the cleanest truth. Afterward, the story circulated among the nurses like a strange miracle. In a world where hygiene was impossible, the very symbol of uncleanliness had exposed disease early enough to save a life. Some began to check the soiled clothes of their patients before throwing them away. The stains became clues, silent witnesses of what the body could not say. It was not a scientific breakthrough, but in the chaos of war, it became a kind of ritual. Before treating a woman, check the fabric she carried closest to her skin. The irony was sharp. For years, society had taught women to be ashamed of bodily fluids, to hide anything that hinted at impurity. Yet in that hospital tent, shame became evidence, and dirt became medicine. The nurses learned to look beyond disgust. They handled each blood-soaked cloth with care, reading its patterns like a map. Some called it superstition, others called it intuition, but it saved more lives than the few vials of penicillin they guarded like treasure. If compared to today, it would be like discovering that the stains on your laundry held more diagnostic value than the machines in a hospital. The woman who survived was never told the details. She believed she had been lucky, that her fever had simply broken on its own. When she left the camp months later, weak but alive, she carried the same dirty garment in her bag. She said it reminded her of the day she was given back her life. The nurses never corrected her. They let the story live as a whisper of hope in a place that had none. The field hospital closed before the war ended. Its floors were stained with years of suffering, its walls silent witnesses to the absurdity of survival. But the legend of the dirty garment that saved a woman lingered. For those who heard it, it became a symbol that even in filth, there could be truth. It was not the kind of miracle that would ever be recorded in official reports. It belonged to the quiet side of history, the one written in sweat, blood, and human endurance. When peace returned, hospitals became clean again. White sheets, white walls, and polished instruments replaced the grime of the past. Yet the lesson endured among older nurses: cleanliness was a privilege, not a guarantee of safety. Disease could hide under perfume just as easily as it did under dirt. The memory of that filthy garment stayed with them, a reminder that sometimes what appears disgusting holds the evidence of life itself. To modern eyes, the story may seem absurd, a dirty pair of underwear as a medical tool, but during the war, it represented something far greater: the power of observation, the thin line between disgust and discovery, and the strange mercy hidden in decay. In the end, it was not science or purity that saved the woman, but the refusal of one nurse to look away. That refusal stands as a quiet testament to what war demanded from women: the ability to find meaning in filth, to see hope where others saw only contamination. The story reminds us that survival is rarely beautiful. It is stained, unpleasant, and sometimes miraculous in its ugliness. The nurse who kept that garment likely never thought of herself as a hero, yet her instinct bridged the space between revulsion and compassion, a space where life, against all odds, managed to continue. The dirty underwear became a symbol whispered in medical circles long after the war, not as an object of shame, but as proof that even in the most degraded conditions, care could still exist. It blurred the line between what was repulsive and what was sacred, between disease and the chance to live. And perhaps that is the most human story of all, that even what we reject, fear, or find disgusting can sometimes carry the key to our salvation. The war ended, but the lesson remained. Cleanliness may protect, but awareness saves. Beneath the surface of disgust, there is always something worth noticing, something that might just keep us alive. Thank you for staying through this long, uneasy journey into the hidden corners of women's lives during the Second World War. May the quiet strength of those who endured remind you that even the most ordinary objects, even the most forgotten acts, can hold the weight of survival. Sleep well tonight, and let the ghosts of their endurance rest softly beside you.